A millionaire forces an elderly man to leave the first-class section of a plane just for wearing old overalls, but when he discovers the man's photos with his father and a mysterious old document, he realizes he has made a huge mistake that will change his life forever. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment below from where are you watching from today. Richard King always got what he wanted. That's just how things worked when you had more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. So when he walked onto that first-class flight to Chicago and saw someone who didn't belong there, he didn't think twice about speaking up. "Excuse me," Richard called out to the flight attendant, not even trying to keep his voice down. "I believe there's been some mistake. This is first class." He pointed at the elderly man in worn overalls a few rows ahead. "That man clearly doesn't belong here." The elderly man, John Parker, kept his eyes down, his weathered hands folded quietly in his lap. He'd saved up for months to buy this ticket, wanting to visit his sick sister in comfort for once in his life. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I've checked his ticket. Mr. Parker has paid for his seat." "Paid for it?" Richard let out a harsh laugh. "Look at him. He probably spent his life savings on it. This is ridiculous. I won't stand for it." Other passengers started staring. Some pulled out their phones, recording everything. Richard didn't care. He was Richard King, CEO of King Enterprises, and he had standards to maintain. "Either he goes or I do," Richard announced. "And trust me, your airline doesn't want me as an enemy." The flight attendant turned to John Parker, her face full of shame. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but would you mind?" John Parker stood up slowly, dignity in every movement. "No need to apologize, miss. I know when I'm not wanted." He gathered his small bag and walked past Richard without a single glance. "Finally," Richard muttered, settling into his seat. "Some people just don't understand their place." What Richard didn't know was that one of those phone videos would go viral within hours. By the time he landed in Chicago, Richard King was trending on social media, and not in a good way. His phone exploded with messages from his PR team. "Mr. King, this is bad," his head of PR, Sarah Martinez, told him over the phone. "People are calling you every horrible name in the book. We need to do damage control immediately." Richard rolled his eyes. "It'll blow over. These things always do." "Not this time," Sarah insisted. "The man you had removed, he's John Parker. He's a respected community leader in his town. He runs a small farm that donates fresh produce to local food banks. People love him." For the first time, Richard felt a twinge of worry. "Fine, draft a statement. Something about maintaining high standards, make it sound good." "A statement won't cut it," Sarah said firmly. "You need to apologize in person, to his face, and it needs to be sincere." Richard wanted to argue, but he could already see the stock prices of King Enterprises dropping on his phone screen. "Fine, set it up." A week later, Richard's sleek black Mercedes pulled up to John Parker's farm. The place was exactly what he expected. Old, worn down, probably worth less than his watch. John Parker was waiting on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair like something out of a country postcard. "Mr. Parker," Richard said, putting on his best apologetic face. "I've come to—" "Save your breath, Mr. King," John interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I know why you're here. Your PR team called ahead." Richard felt his face flush. "Look, what happened on that plane was exactly who you are," John finished. "But that's not what matters now." He stood up and walked into his house, leaving the door open. "Come inside, there's something you need to see." Richard hesitated, then followed him in. The house was small but clean, with old furniture that had been carefully maintained. John led him to a wall covered in photographs. "Take a good look, Mr. King," John said, "especially at that one in the middle." Richard stepped closer, and his heart stopped. There, in a faded photograph, was John Parker, much younger, standing next to Richard's father, Edward King. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a future home of King and Parker Developments. "Sign. That's impossible," Richard whispered. "Your father and I were partners once," John said quietly. "Best friends too, or so I thought." He turned to Richard, his eyes full of something that made Richard want to step back. "Be careful what you trample underfoot, Mr. King. Some roots go deeper than you think." Richard left the farm that day shaken, his mind racing. He had to know more. He had to understand what that photograph meant. But as his car pulled away, he didn't notice John Parker making a phone call. "He saw it," John said into the phone. "The game has begun." Back in his office, Richard started digging through old company files, his father's personal papers, anything he could find. The more he discovered, the sicker he felt. The great Edward King, his perfect father, had built their empire on a foundation of lies. And John Parker? He was just the first victim of many. The truth was about to come out, and Richard King's perfect world was about to crumble. Richard couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that photograph of his father with John Parker. Something wasn't right. His father had never mentioned Parker, not once in all the stories about building King Enterprises. The next morning, Richard marched into his office before sunrise. "Linda," he called to his secretary, "I need everything we have on the company's history. Every file, every document, everything from before 1990. Linda looked surprised. "That's all in the old storage room, Mr. King. Nobody's been down there in years." "Well, I'm going down there now." The storage room was dark and dusty. Richard sneezed as he pulled box after box off the shelves. Hours passed as he dug through yellowing papers, old contracts and faded photographs. Then he found it. A folder marked Parker King Joint Ventures, 1985. Richard's hands shook as he opened it. Inside were documents that made his blood run cold. Partnership agreements, land deals, plans for a massive development project. And there, on every page, were two signatures, Edward King and John Parker. "Oh my God," Richard whispered. He kept reading, and the truth got worse with every page. His father and John Parker hadn't just been partners, they'd been best friends. They'd started with nothing, bought land together, planned to build something great. But then, Edward King had done something unforgivable. He'd forged Parker's signature on transfer documents, stolen the land right out from under him, used Parker's own money to start what would become King Enterprises. Richard felt sick. The company he'd inherited, everything he had, it was all built on theft. His phone rang, making him jump. It was Sarah, his PR manager. "Mr. King, we have another problem," she said. "John Parker just gave an interview to the morning show. It's going viral." Richard turned on the TV in his office. There was Parker sitting in his farmhouse looking straight into the camera. "Yes, I knew Edward King," Parker was saying. "We were partners once. Best friends too. He had big dreams. But he forgot about having a conscience along the way." The interviewer leaned forward. "Are you saying Edward King stole from you?" "I'm saying the King family fortune has roots they don't want anyone to dig up." Richard's phone started ringing again. This time it was Marcus Stone, his biggest investor. "Richard, what the hell is going on?" Marcus demanded. "Our stock is dropping like a rock." "I can handle this," Richard said, but his voice shook. "You better," Marcus growled. "I didn't invest millions to watch it all go down the drain because of some old farmer's story." But it wasn't just a story. Richard looked at the documents in front of him again. It was all true. He drove back to Parker's farm that afternoon. This time Parker was waiting for him with a pot of coffee and an old leather briefcase. "I figured you'd be back," Parker said, pouring 2 cups. "Found those old files, did you?" "Why now?" Richard demanded. "Why come after us after all these years?" Parker smiled sadly. "I'm not coming after anyone, Richard. I'm just telling the truth, something your father never had the courage to do." He opened the briefcase and pulled out more documents. "Your father didn't just steal my land. He destroyed my family. My wife died thinking I was a failure. My kids grew up poor because I couldn't give them anything. All while Edward King built his empire with what he stole from me." Richard sat there listening to Parker's story. How Edward King had convinced Parker to invest everything he had in their partnership. How he'd waited until Parker was at his dying wife's bedside to make his move. How he'd used Parker's own money to bribe officials and falsify documents. "I don't want your money," Parker said finally. "I want justice, and I want you to understand what your father really was." As Richard drove home that night, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted comments. Investors wanted answers. His lawyers wanted to strategize. But all Richard could think about was another document he'd found in that storage room. His father's last letter, written just before he died, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Richard, open when the truth comes. Out." Richard hadn't opened it yet. He wasn't sure he was ready for what was inside. What he didn't know was that across town, Marcus Stone was making a very interesting phone call. "Don't worry, John," Marcus said into his phone. "Everything's going according to plan. Richard King is about to learn what it feels like to lose everything, just like you did." And in his farmhouse, John Parker hung up the phone and looked at another photograph. One he hadn't shown Richard yet. One that would change everything when the time was right. Richard sat in his home office late that night, staring at the sealed envelope from his father. The words, "For Richard, open when the truth comes out," seemed to mock him in his father's familiar handwriting. His hands trembled as he finally opened it. Inside was a letter, written in his father's shaky handwriting, from his last days. "My son, if you're reading this, then John Parker has finally come forward with the truth. I've carried this guilt for 30 years, and now it falls to you to make it right. What I did to John was unforgivable. He was more than my business partner. He was my best friend, the man who loaned me money when your mother was sick, the man who stood by me when no one else would. But I got greedy. When I saw the chance to take everything, I took it. I told myself it was for you, that I was securing your future. But that was a lie. I did it because I was weak and afraid of staying poor. There's something else you need to know. Marcus Stone, who you trust as your biggest investor, was part of it. He helped me forge the documents. He's the one who suggested we strike while John was at the hospital with his dying wife. Don't trust him, Richard. He's been waiting all these years for a chance to take control of King Enterprises, and now he'll use my sins to do it. In my private safe at home, combination 132435, you'll find proof of what really happened. Use it wisely. I'm sorry, son. I hope you can be a better man than I was. Love, Dad." Richard read the letter 3 times before picking up his phone. "Linda, cancel all my meetings tomorrow and get me everything we have on Marcus Stone's involvement with the company." The next morning, Richard drove to his childhood home. The safe was right where his father said it would be, hidden behind a painting in the study. Inside, he found a thick folder labeled Insurance. As he read through the documents, his father's final betrayal became clear. Edward King hadn't just stolen from John Parker. He'd been embezzling from his own company for years. And Marcus Stone had helped him do it, in exchange for secret shares in King Enterprises. Richard's phone rang. It was Sarah, his PR manager, again. "Turn on the news," she said urgently. "Marcus Stone just called an emergency board meeting. He's trying to take control of the company." Richard rushed to the office, the documents from his father's safe clutched in his briefcase. When he walked into the boardroom, Marcus Stone was already there, looking smug. "Huh, Richard?" Marcus said smoothly. "We were just discussing the company's leadership crisis." "Crisis?" Richard looked around the room at the nervous board members. "The only crisis here is the one you helped create 30 years ago." Marcus's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard pulled out the documents. "Really? Because my father kept very detailed records of your involvement in defrauding John Parker and the company." The color drained from Marcus's face. "Those documents were supposed to be destroyed." "My father may have been a thief," Richard said, his voice hard, "but he was smart enough to keep insurance." Before Marcus could respond, the boardroom door opened again. John Parker walked in, followed by a team of FBI agents. "Marcus Stone," one of the agents said, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." As they led Marcus away in handcuffs, John Parker turned to Richard. "Your father called me, you know, right before he died. He couldn't face me himself, but he told me everything about Marcus's plans, about the evidence in the safe." Richard stared at him. "You knew all this time?" John nodded. "I needed to see what kind of man you were, if you'd try to cover it up like your father did, or if you'd face the truth. And now," Richard asked, "now we see if you're ready to make things right." Back in his office, Richard looked out at the city his father had built with stolen dreams. His phone was ringing again. Reporters wanting comments about Marcus Stone's arrest, shareholders panicking about the company's future. But Richard wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about another document he'd found in his father's safe, a deed to a piece of land, the original plot where everything had started, the land that should have belonged to John Parker all along. He picked up his phone and dialed Parker's number. "Mr. Parker, I think it's time we talked about rebuilding, not just the company, but everything." What Richard didn't know was that in her office downtown, Sarah Martinez was looking at an old photograph of her own, one that showed her mother, a young lawyer, meeting with Edward King and Marcus Stone 30 years ago, the same day all the fraudulent documents had been signed. "Oh, Richard," Sarah whispered, "you have no idea how deep this really goes." Sarah Martinez sat alone in her office, staring at the photograph of her mother with Edward King and Marcus Stone. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Mom, we need to talk. It's about Edward King." Across town, Richard was sitting with John Parker in the old farmhouse kitchen. Steam rose from their coffee cups as Richard pushed a folder across the table. "The deed to the original land," Richard said. "It's yours. It should have been yours all along." John didn't touch the folder. "It's not that simple anymore, Richard. That land, there's something your father never told anyone about what's underneath it." "What are you talking about?" "Before your father betrayed me, we discovered something, oil, not just a little, enough to make that worthless farmland worth billions." Richard felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's impossible. The surveys were fake," John interrupted. "Your father paid off the surveyors to hide it. He knew if anyone found out, there'd be questions about who really owned the land." Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Need to meet. Emergency, come alone." Richard found Sarah waiting in the parking garage under the King Enterprises building. She looked like she hadn't slept. "My mother was the lawyer who helped your father steal everything from John Parker," she said without preamble. Richard stared at her. "What?" Sarah pulled out the old photograph. She was fresh out of law school. Edward King promised to make her career if she helped him forge the documents. And she did. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Marcus Stone called my mother from jail this morning. He's threatening to expose everyone who was involved, unless what? Unless we help him take control of King Enterprises." Richard ran his hands through his hair. "This just keeps getting worse." "That's not all," Sarah said. "My mother told me something else. About a secret account your father set up. One that Marcus Stone doesn't know about." Back at his office, Richard dug through his father's old records. He found it hidden in a coded spreadsheet, references to an offshore account containing millions in stolen profits. His computer dinged with a new email. It was from an anonymous sender with just a video attachment. When he played it, he saw his father looking much younger in what looked like a secret meeting. "The oil has to stay hidden," Edward King was saying to someone off camera. "If Parker ever finds out what's really under that land..." The video cut off there. Richard's phone rang immediately, an unlisted number. "Hello? By now you've seen the video," a woman's voice said. "That's just a taste of what I have. Meet me at the old warehouse on Pier 12 tonight if you want the rest." Richard knew it was probably a trap, but he had to know the truth. When he pulled up to the warehouse that night, he was surprised to see lights on inside. He walked in to find an elderly woman sitting at a table. She looked up and smiled, and Richard felt his heart stop. She had Sarah's eyes. "Hello, Richard," she said. "I'm Margaret Martinez, and I've been keeping your father's secrets for 30 years. Margaret stood up slowly. "Your father wasn't just hiding oil, Richard. He was hiding something much bigger, something that could destroy not just King Enterprises, but half the corporations in this city." She pulled out a thick file. "Before I give you this, you need to understand something. People have died to keep these secrets buried. Your father made sure of that." "What are you talking about?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "Ask yourself why John Parker really waited 30 years to come forward. Ask yourself why Marcus Stone was so confident he could take over your company." Margaret pushed the file toward him. "The answers are all in here, but once you know the truth, there's no going back." As Richard reached for the file, the warehouse doors burst open. John Parker walked in, followed by two men Richard had never seen before. "I'm sorry, Richard," John said, looking genuinely sad, "but we can't let you see what's in that file." Back at the farm, Sarah was investigating on her own. In John Parker's study, she found something that made her gasp. A recent photograph of John with Marcus Stone, both of them smiling and shaking hands, and behind them, clearly visible, was a calendar showing yesterday's date. The pieces were starting to come together, but not in the way anyone had expected. In his jail cell, Marcus Stone smiled as he hung up his phone. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Soon the real truth about Edward King and the empire he built would come to light. And Richard, he was about to learn that some family legacies are better left buried. Richard raised his hands slowly as John Parker's men moved toward him. "John, what is this? I thought we were working together." "We were," John said, his face grim, "until you started digging too deep. Some truths are better left buried, Richard." Margaret Martinez stood up, surprisingly calm. "It's too late, John. He needs to know what really happened that night." "What night?" Richard looked between them. "What are you talking about?" Before anyone could answer, the warehouse lights went out. There was a sound of breaking glass, shouts, and when the lights came back on seconds later, Margaret and the file were gone. "Find her," John shouted to his men. but Richard was already running out the back door and into the dark night. His phone rang as he drove away. It was Sarah. "Richard, where are you? You need to see this right now." 20 minutes. Later, Richard stared at the photograph in Sarah's hands. John Parker and Marcus Stone together, taken just yesterday. "They're working together," Sarah said. "They always were. This whole thing, it was a setup from the start." Richard shook his head. "But why? What could be worth all this?" "I think I know," Sarah said. She pulled out her laptop and opened a file. "I've been going through old company records. The land your father stole from John Parker, it's not just sitting on oil, it's the key to something bigger." She turned the screen toward Richard. On it was a map of underground tunnels and storage facilities, all centered around the disputed land. During the Cold War, the government built secret bunkers there. Your father found out about them when he and John were first buying the land. But what they found inside, a knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah checked the security camera feed on her phone and gasped. It was her mother, Margaret. They let her in quickly. She was breathing hard, clutching a manila envelope. "They almost caught me," she said, locking the door behind her. "But they didn't get this." She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of old photographs. Richard's breath caught as he looked at them. The photos showed a massive underground facility, men in military uniforms, crates being loaded onto trucks, and in several pictures, Edward King and a much younger John Parker overseeing everything. "Your father and John didn't just find oil," Margaret explained. "They found one of the largest secret government storage facilities in the country. Weapons, gold, documents that could change history. The oil was just a cover story." "But why would my father betray John over this?" Richard asked. "Because someone made him an offer he couldn't refuse," Margaret said. "Someone powerful enough to make people disappear." She pulled out one last photo. It showed Edward King shaking hands with a man whose face had been carefully cut out of the picture. "That man is still alive," Margaret said, "still in power, and he's been pulling the strings all along." Sarah's phone buzzed. A news alert. She read it and went pale. Marcus Stone was just found dead in his cell. Richard's phone rang next. It was John Parker. "By now you know too much," John said without preamble. "But it's not too late to fix this. Meet me at the farm, come alone, or Sarah's mother won't live through the night." After he hung up, Richard looked at Sarah and Margaret. "I have to go." "It's a trap," Sarah said. "Of course it is." Richard checked his gun, making sure it was loaded. "But I need to know the truth, about all of it." What he didn't tell them was that he'd received one more piece of evidence. A video file sent to his phone just minutes ago. It showed his father's last moments alive, and they didn't match the official story of a heart attack. In the video, Edward King was meeting with someone in his office late at night. There was an argument, a struggle, and then Richard deleted the video. He'd seen enough to know what he had to do. As he drove toward Parker's farm, he didn't notice the black SUV following him. Inside it, a man spoke quietly into a phone. "He's on his way, yes sir, everything is proceeding according to plan." In the passenger seat, a woman smiled. Even after all these years, she still wore the wedding ring Edward King had given her before he married Richard's mother. The truth about the King family was about to come out. All of it. The gravel crunched under Richard's tires as he pulled up to Parker's farm. The old house looked different in the darkness, more threatening somehow. A single light burned in the kitchen window. Before he could reach the porch, the front door opened. John Parker stood there, but he wasn't alone. Next to him was a woman Richard hadn't seen in 25 years. "Hello, Richard," she said softly. "It's been a long time." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Mom?" Eleanor King looked exactly as he remembered her, except for the silver in her dark hair. She'd disappeared when he was 12, leaving nothing but a note saying she couldn't take it anymore. His father had told him she'd run off with another man. "What are you doing here?" Richard's voice shook. "Why are you with him?" "Because I'm the only one who knows the whole truth," Eleanor said. "About your father, about John, about everything." John gestured toward the house. "Come inside, Richard. It's time you learned what really happened 25 years ago." In the kitchen, Eleanor poured coffee while Richard tried to stop his hands from shaking. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light, the same ring he'd seen in the black SUV. "Your father didn't steal this land from John," Eleanor began. "They stole it together from the government, from the people who built those bunkers." "What are you talking about?" "Edward and John were recruited by a secret government program," she continued. "They were supposed to be caretakers, making sure the facility stayed hidden, but when they discovered what was really stored down there, they got greedy," John finished. We all did. Eleanor nodded. The three of us made a plan. We'd expose the facility, claim we'd stumbled onto it accidentally. The government would have to buy us out for billions to keep it quiet. But something went wrong, Richard guessed. Your father betrayed us, John said. He made a deal with Senator Harrison Blake. The senator would help him take control of Phi. Everything, and in return, Edward would make sure certain items from the bunker disappeared forever. Eleanor finished. Things that could have changed history, proved things the public was never meant to know. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. FBI just found Marcus Stone's killer. You won't believe who it was. Before he could, read more, John pulled out a gun. That's enough storytelling, he said. Where's the file Margaret gave you? I don't have it, Richard said. Why does it matter now? Marcus Stone is dead. Marcus was just a pawn, Eleanor said sadly. The real player is still out there. Senator Blake is running for president, Richard. He can't afford for any of this to come out. Then why tell me all this? Richard demanded. Because you have a choice to make, John said. Help us stop Blake or join your father. Join my father. He died of a heart attack. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Is that what you think? Show him the video, John. John pulled out a laptop and played a video, the same one Richard had received earlier. But this version didn't stop after the struggle in Edward's office. It kept going, showing the full truth of how Edward King had died. Blake sent someone to kill him, Eleanor said. Because your father finally grew a conscience. He was going to confess everything. Suddenly they heard cars pulling up outside. Bright lights flooded the windows. FBI, come out with your hands up. John smiled grimly. Right on schedule. Your friend Sarah sold us out, Richard. Just like her mother did 25 years ago. But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at his mother's hands. She'd taken off her wedding ring, and underneath was a mark he recognized. The same distinctive scar he'd seen in photos of Senator Blake's wife before she'd had plastic surgery. You're not my mother, he said quietly. Eleanor King really did leave 25 years ago. You're working for Blake. The woman's face changed, became harder. Smart boy, just like your father. Too smart for your own good. She raised a gun, but before she could fire, the kitchen window exploded. Sarah Martinez crashed through it, gun drawn. FBI, drop your weapons. In the chaos that followed, Richard saw John Parker slip away through a hidden door behind the pantry. The fake Eleanor was tackled by FBI agents, and Sarah was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. I'm sorry, she gasped as Richard helped her up. I had to call them, but there's something else you need to know. Something about your real mother. She handed him a photograph. It showed Eleanor King, the real one, standing in front of a familiar building, the same warehouse where he'd met Margaret Martinez. The photo was dated yesterday. She's alive, Richard, Sarah said, and she knows where the real evidence is, the proof that can bring down Blake and everyone involved. Richard looked at the storm of FBI agents sweeping the house, then at the hidden door where John had disappeared. Take care of things here, he told Sarah. I need to find my mother. As he drove away, his phone rang. An unknown number. Hello, Richard, a woman's voice said, his real mother's voice. I heard you've been looking for the truth. Come to where it all began. And Richard, hurry, we don't have much time. Behind him, in the farmhouse, agents discovered the entrance to the tunnels. And deep below in the darkness, John Parker was already making his way toward a secret only two people had ever known about. The real Eleanor King was one. The other was Senator Blake, and they were both heading for the same place. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel as he raced through the dark streets. His mother's words echoed in his head. Come to where it all began. He knew exactly where she meant. The original King and Parker office building downtown. It had been abandoned for years, but his father had never sold it. Now he knew why. The old building loomed ahead, its windows dark except for one light on the top floor. As Richard parked, his phone rang. It was Sarah. Richard, be careful, she said, her voice urgent. We found something in the farmhouse tunnels. Documents about your mother. She's not who you think. The call cut off. Richard tried calling back, but there was no signal. The building's front door was unlocked. Inside, dust covered everything except for a set of fresh footprints leading to the elevator. But when Richard pressed the button, nothing happened. The stairs, a woman's voice called from above. Like when you were little. Richard's heart jumped. He remembered coming here as a child, racing up the stairs while his mother called after him to be careful. Following the memory, he found the stairwell. 25 years melted away with each step. The smell of old wood and pipe smoke, the creaky third step on each flight, the way his mother's heels used to click on the metal strips at the edge of each stair. He heard those same clicks now, coming from above. On the top floor, a single office light glowed. Richard walked toward it, his hand near his gun. When he reached the doorway, he stopped cold. Eleanor King sat at his father's old desk, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared. Same dark hair, same gentle smile, same blue eyes that Richard saw in the mirror every morning. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "You've grown so much." "Mom," Richard's voice cracked. "Is it really you this time?" She stood up slowly. "It's me. I know you met the other woman, Blake's wife. She's been playing me for years, helping them keep their secrets." "Why did you leave?" Richard demanded. "Why didn't you take me with you?" "Oh, Richard." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "I tried. The night I discovered what your father was involved in, I packed bags for both of us. But Blake's men caught me at the airport. They said if I ever contacted you, you'd have an accident like your father's best friend." "Dad's best friend?" Richard frowned. "You mean John Parker?" Eleanor shook her head. "No. Thomas Reed. The man who actually owned this land before your father and John stole it. The man they murdered and buried in the bunker." Richard felt the floor sway under his feet. "What?" "That's what's really in that hidden file, Richard. Proof that your father and John Parker killed Thomas Reed. The oil, the government bunkers, those were just covers for an even darker truth." She pulled out an old photograph. It showed 3 men, Edward King, John Parker, and a third man Richard had never seen before, all standing in front of the building they were in now. "Thomas Reed discovered something in those tunnels," Eleanor continued. "Something that scared him so badly he tried to back out of the deal. So your father and John silenced him. But I saw it happen. I tried to stop it." Footsteps in the hallway made them both turn. John Parker stood there, gun raised. "I wondered if you'd ever tell him the truth, Eleanor," he said, "about how you helped us hide the body, about how you took Reed's money and ran." "That's a lie," Eleanor snapped. "Is it?" John smiled coldly. "Show him the account statements, Eleanor. Show him where Thomas Reed's millions really went." Before either could move, more footsteps approached. Sarah appeared behind John, her own gun drawn. "FBI, drop the weapon, Parker." But John just laughed. "You too, Agent Martinez, or should I say Thomas Reed's granddaughter?" Richard's head spun as he looked at Sarah. She met his eyes steadily. "That's right," she said. "I've been undercover for years, waiting for a chance to prove what they did to my grandfather. And now I finally have it." She pulled out her phone and played a recording. John Parker's voice filled the room. "We had to kill Reed. He knew too much about the senator's connection to the bodies in the bunker." Eleanor gasped. "The other bodies? You told me Reed was the only one." "Wake up, Eleanor," John snarled. "Why do you think Blake protected us all these years? That bunker isn't just a storage facility. It's a graveyard. And your precious Edward helped fill it." Suddenly, the building's power cut out. In the darkness, Richard heard scrambling, a gunshot, breaking glass. When emergency lights flickered on, John was gone. Sarah ran to the window. "He's heading for the tunnels. The entrance is under this building." But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at his mother, who had slumped against the desk, blood spreading across her chest. "Mom? Mom!" Eleanor grabbed his hand. "The safe," she gasped. "Behind the painting. The real evidence." Her hand went slack in his. Sarah was calling for backup, but her voice seemed far away. Richard moved like a man in a dream, toward the painting he remembered from his childhood. Behind it was a small wall safe. The combination was the same one his father had used for everything, Richard's birthday. Inside was a single USB drive and a note in his mother's handwriting. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, then Blake's people finally found me. But what's on this drive will expose everything, the murders, the cover-ups, the real reason they needed this land. Your father wasn't a monster at first. Blake corrupted him, just like he corrupted John. The truth is all here. I love you, Mom." As Richard stared at the note, Sarah's phone rang. Her face went white as she listened. "Richard," she said, "they just found another body in the tunnels. It's Marcus Stone. He's not dead. The body in the jail cell was another fake." "Then who—" Before he could finish, the floor beneath them exploded. The explosion threw Richard and Sarah across the room. Through the ringing in his ears, Richard heard shouting and footsteps coming up the stairs. "We have to move." Sarah grabbed his arm. "They're coming to destroy the evidence." Richard clutched the USB drive from the safe taking one last look at his mother's body before following Sarah through a side door. They found a maintenance stairwell just as voices echoed through the main hallway. "Find King and Martinez. Senator Blake wants them eliminated." They raced down the stairs, going deeper than Richard remembered the building having floors. The air grew colder, damper. "The tunnels connect to the old building," Sarah explained as they ran. "My grandfather discovered them by accident. That's what got him killed." They reached the bottom of the stairs. Sarah pulled out a flashlight, revealing rough stone walls and a long corridor disappearing into darkness. "How did you really get involved in this?" Richard asked as they moved forward. "When did you know about your grandfather?" "I was recruited by the FBI right out of college," Sarah said. They'd been investigating Blake for years, but could never get enough evidence. "When they discovered my connection to Thomas Reed, they knew I was their best shot at infiltrating King Enterprises." A distant explosion made dust rain down from the ceiling. "They're sealing the tunnels," Sarah said. "We need to hurry." They turned a corner and stopped short. The tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber. Row after row of metal storage. Containers filled the space, each marked with dates going back decades. "My God," Richard whispered. "How many people did they hide down here?" "Too many." John Parker's voice came from behind them. He stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. "Every person who ever threatened Blake's rise to power. Your father helped. Make them disappear." "Why?" Richard demanded. "Why did you help him?" "Because Blake owned us all." John's hand shook. "Once you're part of his web, there's no getting out. Your father tried. Look what happened to him." More footsteps approached. Marcus Stone emerged from another tunnel, very much alive. "Hello." "Richard," he said smoothly. "Surprised to see me?" "The body in the jail cell," Sarah said. "Another of Blake's people?" Marcus nodded. "A necessary sacrifice, like your mother, Richard. She was getting too brave, thinking she could expose everything." Richard's grip tightened on his gun. "You killed her?" "Blake's orders," Marcus said. "Just like he ordered. Edward King's death when he grew a conscience. Just like he ordered us to clean up this mess tonight." Suddenly the chamber's emergency lights kicked on. FBI agents poured in from multiple tunnels, guns drawn. "Federal agents, everyone freeze." But Marcus just smiled. He pulled out a remote detonator. "I don't think so. This entire facility is wired to blow. One press and all the evidence disappears, along with everyone in these tunnels." "You'll die too," Sarah said. "Small price to pay to protect the next President of the United States." "You really think Blake will be president?" Richard laughed harshly. "Check the USB drive from my mother's safe. It's already uploading everything to the internet. Every murder, every cover-up, every body you hid down here." Marcus's smile faltered. John Parker suddenly swung his gun toward him. "You said Blake would protect us," John shouted. "You said we'd be taken care of." "Blake protects his own interests," Richard said. "Just like he did when he had my father killed. Just like he did with my mother tonight." Marcus's finger moved toward the detonator button. Multiple guns fired at once. The remote flew from Marcus's hand as he fell. John Parker clutched his bleeding shoulder where an FBI bullet had hit him, and through the chaos, Richard saw a figure running down another tunnel. "Sarah, there's another exit that way. They're trying to seal us in." They chased after the figure, leaving the FBI to secure Marcus and John. The tunnel sloped upward, leading to what looked like a maintenance room under Parker's farm. They burst through a hidden door into the farmhouse basement. Standing there, calmly waiting, was Senator Harrison Blake himself. "I have to admit," Blake said, "you've caused me quite a bit of trouble. Richard, just like your mother." "It's over, Senator," Sarah said, raising her gun. "The evidence is already out." "Is it?" Blake smiled. "Check your phones. No signal down here. No internet. No upload." Richard's blood ran cold as he checked his phone. Blake was right. "The USB drive," Blake continued, "is still in your pocket. And in about 2 minutes, the charges we set will bring this whole building down on top of the tunnels. No evidence. No witnesses." He pulled out his own gun. "Your father made the mistake of thinking he could expose me. Your mother made the same mistake tonight. I had such hopes you'd be smarter, Richard." "Drop your weapon, Senator." Sarah's voice was steel. "Or what, Agent Martinez? You'll shoot a presidential candidate? Think of the scandal. Think of the bodies in those tunnels," Richard said. "All those families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. Necessary sacrifices for the greater good," Blake said. "Your father understood that in the end." "My father was a coward," Richard spat. "He helped you murder innocent people." "No, Richard," a new voice said. "Your father tried to stop it." They all turned. Eleanor King stood in the doorway, bleeding but alive, holding a phone that was very much connected to the internet. How? Blake's composure cracked. The vest caught most of it, Eleanor said. Standard FBI issue. Isn't that right, Director? Chase. An older man stepped up behind her, flanked by more agents. Senator Blake, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, among other charges. The upload is complete, Eleanor told Richard. Everything, the bodies, the cover-ups. Blake's presidential campaign is over. You were working with the FBI? Richard asked. Eleanor nodded. For years. Gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Your father was doing the same at the end. That's why Blake had him killed. As agents moved to arrest Blake, he made one last desperate move, raising his gun toward Richard. 3 shots rang out. Blake fell. Sarah lowered her gun, smoke, still curling from the barrel. For my grandfather, she said quietly. Later, as FBI teams swarmed the tunnels and news crews gathered outside, Richard sat with his mother and Sarah in the farmhouse kitchen. There's something else you need to know, Eleanor said. She pulled out one final photograph. About who really owned this land before Thomas Reed, about why Blake wanted it so badly. She laid the photo on the table. Richard stared at it, understanding finally dawning. The truth was bigger than any of them had imagined. Richard stared at the photograph his mother had placed on the kitchen table. The image showed a group of Native American leaders signing a treaty with government officials dated 1952. In the background, barely visible, was a familiar symbol, the same one he'd seen marked on the oldest containers in the underground. Tunnels. I don't understand, Richard said. What does this have to do with Blake? Eleanor's hands shook as she pulled out more documents. The land didn't belong to Thomas Reed originally. It belonged to the Standing Rock tribe. They were forced to sell it to the government for a fraction of its worth. But before they left, the tribal elders hid something in those tunnels. Something that could change everything. Sarah leaned forward. What did they hide? Proof, Eleanor said. Proof that government officials, including Blake's father, had been systematically destroying evidence of illegal weapons testing on tribal lands. Proof that could overturn hundreds of land deals worth billions of dollars. That's why Blake wanted to be president, Richard realized, to make sure these treaties could never be challenged. Your father discovered the truth by accident, Eleanor continued. He found the original documents hidden in the deepest part of the tunnels. That's when he decided to turn against Blake. The farmhouse kitchen door burst open. Margaret Martinez rushed in, clutching her laptop. You need to see this, she said, setting it on the table. The files from the USB drive just finished uploading. There's something else hidden in the data. They gathered around the screen, as Margaret pulled up encrypted files that had been buried deep in the drive's code. Edward King didn't just keep records of Blake's murders, Margaret explained. He kept evidence of every corrupt deal, every stolen piece of land, going back 50 years. He was building a case to expose the entire system. But why didn't he come forward sooner? Sarah asked. Eleanor touched Richard's hand. Because of you, sweetheart. Blake threatened to kill you if your father ever talked. That's why I had to disappear, to protect you while I gathered evidence from the outside. Richard's phone rang. It was FBI Director Chase. Turn on the news, he said urgently. Now. Margaret pulled up a news live stream on her laptop. Every major network was carrying the same breaking story. Senator Harrison Blake had died from his wounds, but not before making a recorded confession. The video played, showing Blake in his hospital bed, his voice weak but clear. I confess to ordering the murders of Edward King, Thomas Reed, and countless others. Their bodies are hidden in the tunnels beneath the old King and Parker building, but the truth goes deeper. The weapons testing, the stolen lands, it was all part of a plan spanning generations. And now, the video cut off abruptly. That's all we got, Director Chase said over the phone. But it's enough. Combined with the evidence from the USB drive, we can unravel the whole conspiracy. Suddenly, the farmhouse lights flickered. A deep rumbling came from below. They're destroying the tunnels. Sarah jumped up. Blake's other allies are trying to bury the evidence. There's still something down there, Eleanor said urgently. Something your father hid in the lowest level. Something even Blake didn't know about. The original tribal documents, Richard asked. No. Eleanor's face was grave. The names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Politicians, judges, business leaders, all of them. Your father called it his legacy insurance. Another rumble shook the house. Dust fell from the ceiling. We have to get down there, Sarah said. before it's all buried forever. Richard looked at his mother. You knew about this all along, ever since you disappeared. You were working to expose them. Eleanor nodded. I had help. Someone on the inside who'd been gathering evidence even longer than I had. Who? Before she could answer, the kitchen floor exploded upward. Through the settling dust, a figure emerged from a hidden tunnel entrance none of them had known about. Richard's heart stopped when he saw who it was. Hello, son, Edward King said. Sorry I'm late to the party. Richard stared at his father in disbelief. Edward King looked older, grayer, but very much alive. His expensive suit was covered in dust from the tunnel, but his eyes were sharp and clear. You're supposed to be dead, Richard whispered. Blake's men killed you. They tried, Edward said, brushing dust from his sleeve. But your mother and I had been planning my escape for months. We knew Blake would make his move eventually. Eleanor moved to Edward's side, taking his hand. We had to make it look real, had to make Blake think he'd won. It was the only way to finish gathering. The evidence. Another explosion rocked the farmhouse. Edward's face turned serious. We don't have much time. Blake's organization is trying to destroy everything, but they don't know about the vault. What vault? Sarah asked, gun still ready. The real reason this land was so important, Edward explained. Follow me, all of you. They descended into the tunnel beneath the kitchen. Edward led them down passages none of them had seen before, deeper than the other tunnels. The tribal elders didn't just hide documents down here, Edward said as they walked. They hid proof of something bigger, something that could change the course of American history. They reached a solid steel door set into the rock. Edward pulled out an old key. Blake's father didn't just test weapons on tribal lands, he continued, turning the key. He tested something else, something they developed during World War II, a way to control people's minds. The vault door swung open. Inside was a small room filled with filing cabinets and old film reels. The experiments worked, Eleanor said softly. That's how they built their power, how they got people to sign, away their lands, their rights, how they made witnesses disappear or change their stories. Mind control? Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. That's impossible. Edward pulled out a film reel. See for yourself, but be careful. Even watching these recordings can be dangerous. That's why we had to wait, had to make sure we had enough proof of the conventional crimes first. Nobody would believe this part without the other evidence to back it up. More rumbling from above. The tunnel walls cracked. The charges they set are going off, Sarah said. This whole place is going to collapse. Not this section, Edward said confidently. I reinforced it years ago, but we need to get this evidence out now. Richard, help me with these cabinets. As they worked to quickly pack the most important files and films, Richard had to ask, why didn't you tell me you were alive all these years? Because you had to react genuinely to everything, Eleanor answered. Your pain, your anger, it had to be real. Blake was watching you every moment. And John Parker, was he part of this too? Edward shook his head. John was another victim. Blake used the mind control technology on him years ago. That's why his behavior seemed to change so drastically. The real John Parker died the day they experimented on him. What was left was just a puppet. They finished loading the evidence into waterproof containers, just as the first tunnel collapsed behind them. There's another way out, Edward said, moving to the back of the vault. It leads to the old tribal caves. They run for miles under, to this land. As they hurried through the narrow passage, Eleanor explained more. The tribal elders knew about the mind control experiments. They built these caves not just as hiding places, but as shelters. The rock down here blocks the frequencies they use to control people's minds. They emerged from the caves an hour later, miles from the farm. FBI teams were waiting, along with representatives from the Standing Rock tribe. The evidence? Director Chase asked. Edward handed over the containers. Everything. The mind control experiments, the names of everyone involved, proof of every crime they committed. Enough to expose not just Blake's organization, but the entire system of corruption they built. And the tribal lands? One of the native leaders asked. All the original documents proving your claims, Eleanor said, plus evidence that the sales were conducted under the influence of their mind control technology. Every treaty they forced will be invalidated. Over the next few weeks, the truth came out in waves. The public learned about the murders first, then the corruption, then finally, when people were ready to believe it, the mind control experiments. John Parker, freed from decades of mental conditioning, recovered his true memories in a special facility. Marcus Stone and Blake's other allies faced justice. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners. 1 month later, Richard sat with his parents on the porch of a new house, far from the old farm. Sarah joined them, bringing coffee. "The last of Blake's network was arrested today," she reported. "It's really over." "Not quite," Edward said. "There's one more thing we need to do." He handed Richard an envelope. Inside was a deed to a new piece of land. "The tribe wanted us to have it," Eleanor explained. "A place to build something new, something honest." Richard looked at the plans his father had drawn up, not for a business empire this time, but for a community center, a place of healing. "What do you say, son?" Edward asked. "Ready to build a new legacy?" Richard looked at his parents, then at Sarah, seeing a future he never could have imagined a few months ago. "Yes," he said, "but this time, we do it right." On the hill above their new land, the sun set on the old world of corruption and secrets. Tomorrow would bring a new day, a new beginning, and this time the truth would stay in the light. The end.